last presentation considered the jus ad bellum criteria in just war theory. Those are the things that just war theory says one must consider before making a decision to go to war, if one wants to be able to claim to be fighting a justified war. One must have legitimate authority to wage war, a just cause. One must only intend the achievement of that just cause and nothing else. War must be a last resort, and you must have a reasonable chance of success. Even if one wins, one must still be confident that the good you will do will outweigh the evil caused even in victory.
Now, be clear that while just war theory envisions the possibility that war is sometimes justified, it also suggests that there are limits on how we may wage even a justified war. Though one may have a solid justification for going to war as a nation, that does not mean anything goes once you're in war. The jus in bello, or justice, righteousness, morality in war criteria, spell out the two major considerations that just war theory suggests limit what we may do in war. Those criteria are discrimination and proportionality again, although proportionality understood a bit differently. The principle of discrimination says basically that one may never directly attack civilians or non-combatants. One may never make civilians, non-soldiers, non-military targets, the object of one's destructive and lethal violence. Now, this criteria reflects, for Christian just war theorists, it reflects the grounding of just war theory in universal neighbor love. Remember, Jesus said to love your neighbor as yourself, even your enemy. Love even your enemies. Just war theorists have said that there could be no possible justification for war from within that framework unless we recognize this responsibility to limit warfare to military targets. Our love for the enemy, so to speak, manifests itself in our restraining ourselves such that we do not directly or intentionally attack those who are not a lethal threat to us, the civilians or non-combatants in a society. I think this also reflects a profound awareness of the universality of human sin. Remember, we have said that Christian faith or a Christian worldview begins with this belief in salvation upon which all people depend, because all people, ourselves and others, ourselves and our enemies, are sinners. That has relevance when we go to war. Even in a justified war, it is not us or we who are good and pure over against those who are evil sinners. No, we are all evil sinners. We may have greater justification than our enemy for using violence in this war. Our cause may be just, but the enemy remains my neighbor that I must love. And as such, I will not kill enemy non-combatants or civilians. Now, this idea of discriminating between military and non-military targets, between soldiers and non-combatants or civilians, should not be confused with discriminating between the guilty and the innocent. The issue is not a subjective evaluation of the moral status of different people among the enemy. Rather, it's a discrimination between their actual roles in the society. And this is important because many societies use some form of draft or some ways in which they coerce or force their young men and increasingly women into the military and into this deadly war. Those innocent youth, or those youth among the enemy, may be morally innocent, And you can imagine elderly senior citizens who have political power. They may be the ones who have formed and shaped the policies that have brought this nation to war. They are morally guilty, we might say. But that doesn't mean that we're to attack the morally guilty while restraining ourselves against the morally innocent. The issue here is the person on the other side a soldier, a part of the military apparatus of the nation with which we are at war, or is he or she merely a civilian? Even among those civilians, some just war theorists say that we must distinguish particular kinds of roles here. War has become increasingly total in the modern era, where it's whole societies and the whole apparatus of society against another society, and not just its military. Obviously, the military depends upon the economic productivity of the nation of which it is part. Does that mean the whole economic apparatus of the country becomes a military target? Just war theorists, in terms of this distinction between military and non-military targets, has said no. And one way to think about this is in terms of roles. For example, soldiers must eat. Therefore, are farmers military targets? Just war theorists have typically said no. Now, are factory workers in a factory making bombs? Well, yes. One might say in that role, one has become a part of the military structure of the army against which you wage war. So are you serving human needs in your role? Well, as a farmer, you are, because all people need to eat, not just soldiers. But as a worker in an armaments factory, you're not meeting human needs now. You're meeting military needs and could well be subject to attack. Another thing that this principle of discrimination has suggested is that ex-combatants may not be attacked. So prisoners of war, the sick, or the wounded have become non-combatants. They have now been neutralized, so to speak, militarily, and we may not kill prisoners of war. We may not kill the sick or the wounded until they return to combat. Now, in modern warfare, sometimes people, nations, the military in one nation or the other holds its own civilians hostage. That is to say, sometimes, taking advantage of these rules of war, you might say, sometimes military targets are placed near or next to or within and among civilian targets. You might put a center for the command and control of your army next to a hospital or a school, hoping somehow that will limit the attacks of your enemy and in some ways defend your military apparatus. Sometimes that's done intentionally. Of course, more and more in a modern society, military targets and civilian targets are mixed. For example, I think most of us would think that flying those airplanes into the World Trade Center was a violation of this criteria. It was an attack on non-combatants, innocent civilians. But of course, there were military offices in those towers. Now, had the United States government put those military targets there precisely to be able to claim that they were not legitimate targets for attack? That's debatable or questionable, but this only shows how complicated this issue becomes. And that's this issue of urbanized contexts in which civilian and military targets are mixed. Of course, guerrilla warfare raises the same issue, because in guerrilla warfare, the enemy soldiers, or if we engage in guerrilla warfare, our soldiers are disguising themselves as citizens, are moving in and out of military and civilian roles to take advantage of the reluctance of the other side to attack non-combatants, to be able to spring surprise attacks. How do you follow this criteria in a context of urban guerrilla warfare. One interesting conceptual tool that has been used within the processes of moral discernment related to the principle of non-discrimination is something called the principle of double effect. The principle of double effect is concerned to help us discern whether we are morally justified to do some act that has two sets of consequences, one good and one evil. May we do an act where our intention is to do something good, or something justified, but there is something evil that also results. In this context, may we attack military targets, knowing full well that we will accidentally also kill innocent civilians? Well, the principle of double effect says, yes, you may well be morally justified in doing that, so long as one only intends the good effect. One's intention is only to kill soldiers. One's intention is only to destroy or weaken the military power of the enemy. One's intention is not to kill as many of its civilians as possible, but still, some are killed. But secondly, the principle of double effect says the evil unintended means or effect may not be a means to the good. All right, so the good is the defeat of your enemy, or the good requires the defeat of your enemy. What if one discovers that what's bringing your enemy to its knees is not your weakening of its military apparatus, not your destruction of its army, but rather the massive civilian deaths you are causing? In effect, have you not become a terrorist? That is to say, you're actually terrorizing the civilians of the other society unintentionally. But that terror is what is causing the enemy to relent. Then the evil that you had not intended has become a means to the good, the defeat of the enemy and the restoring of justice and peace that you intend. Finally, the principle of double effect says you must consider whether the good you are achieving is outweighed by the evil that you had not intended, but is also a part of what you're doing. If that unintended evil is disproportionate to the good, then you may not engage in that particular strategy within your waging of war. That, very quickly, is the principle of double effect as it applies to war. So remember, we are considering what are the limits or restraints we must recognize, even within a war that is morally justified. The second criteria is another version of the principle of proportionality. And it suggests, in an overall sense, one may only use that level of lethal destructive force necessary to achieve one's legitimate military objectives, and no more. One may not, in a sense, disproportionately punish the enemy. Now, this can be understood as applying to the overall level of force or overall destructiveness of the war that you wage, but also can be understood as was implied in the role of proportionality and double effect as it relates to limited attacks within the war or specific aspects of the overall war strategy. One may never use more force than is necessary to capture that bridge, or to conquer that town, or to destroy the capacity of that army to resist your advance. Again, a profound and serious limitation on the use of lethal force. So all this together, both those the ad bellum and in bello criteria, suggests some pretty profound and significant moral considerations related to the waging of war. We can only wage war with a just cause, as a last resort, when our intention is to achieve peace. We must have a chance to win, and our victory must be proportionate, or what we achieve must be proportionate. And even then, we must never directly attack civilians, and we must only use that level of force that is minimally necessary to achieve our objectives, and no more. Well, just war theory is a persuasive tradition within Christianity. It may well be the dominant tradition within Christianity. It is surely reasonable. It is surely serious in its attempt to apply a Christian worldview and Christian moral commitments to the issues that are raised by profound injustice and aggression within human society. But just like pacifism, there are significant critical questions we can raise with respect to just war theory. And first may well be whether killing in war can ever truly be consistent with love of enemies. Are the just war limitations on the applicability of Jesus' teaching and example persuasive, valid, or are they merely a cover for other quite unchristian, unmoral motives? The Christian community often sees itself as having a distinctive role and a distinctive set of responsibilities related to the mission that it has been given. Its responsibility to share the good news of the gospel and to share faith, hope, and love around the world. Does just war theory undermine or compromise that distinctive Christian mission? Can one truly fulfill one's obligations to Christ while serving in military roles in the nations of which one is a part as a Christian? What should Christian people do when their own leaders in their churches disagree with those legitimate authorities who apply the just war criteria in their governmental decision making? We have seen multiple situations in the last 40 years where church leaders within the United States have been in profound disagreement with the leaders of the nation. Now, surely every individual Christian has the right and the responsibility to make moral judgments for himself and herself. But surely it is also troubling when the leaders of churches make profound moral judgments and the people they supposedly lead listen to their government leaders and not their church leaders. Fourth question that might be raised is whether modern warfare can possibly be restrained in the ways that just war theory imagines within the jus in bello criteria. There are pacifists among us who are sometimes called modern war pacifists or a while ago nuclear pacifists. And their argument was that while they were in theory just warriors, modern warfare had become so lethal, so destructive, so all-encompassing that modern war could not be just. Certainly nuclear war could not be just. Does just war theory itself and its criteria lead to a practical commitment to nonviolence? Of course, one could ask questions about just war theory from another direction entirely and say, are the just war theory criteria in fact too restrictive? One way to think about this is in terms of what General Sherman in the Civil War said, the Northern general, the U.S. general, who said, war is hell. Well, surely we all agree that war is hell. Well, if war is hell, do any rules apply? And if war is hell, shouldn't we do anything necessary and possible to get out of war and back into a situation of some kind of relative peace, even if that meant violating the careful criteria of the just war theory. If one's ends are just, and here we're suggesting we can think of this in terms of that whole issue I've talked to you about before. Do the ends justify the means? If one's ends are just, if all one is doing is trying to preserve the integrity of one's own nation and the justice of its order, does morality require us to be so restrictive in the use of means necessary to protect that end? Or, in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., are the means we use always implicit in the ends? That is to say, if we use violent, deadly, destructive, hateful means, should we expect anything other than a bad end? Well, those are all difficult questions, and no one should pretend to have easy answers. I surely don't.